All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Carrie Forrest. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Lowcountry Program Director for the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation. I'm joined today by my colleague, Rebecca Judd, who is the Conservation Program Officer for Chicago and the Lowcountry. We're thrilled to share our updated strategy with you today. We would first like to acknowledge that we are in the Lowcountry, which prior to European colonization was home to numerous native tribes. From the Georgia state line through the southern half of Charleston County was the Muskogee Nation, while the northern half of Charleston to the North Carolina border consisted of the Siouan tribes. Today, the Catawba, Edisto, Wassamasaw, Santee, and Waccamaw are the federal and or state recognized tribes in the region, among many other Native communities. Before we begin, we would like to show you a welcome from the Donnelly Foundation Executive Director, David Farron. He was unable to join us today, but wanted to extend his greetings.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. It's great to have so many folks registered for today. I'm David Farron, the Executive Director of the Foundation. I'm lucky that I have one foot here in Chicago and the other firmly planted in the Lowcountry. It's my particular pleasure to share some opening thoughts about our evolving conservation support since I've been active in this field in the Lowcountry for 30 years now. In fact, the role of the foundation has spanned 70 years, and our founders, Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly, were personally very active in conservation, including setting an example with stewardship of their property in the Ace Basin. In short, conservation is in our DNA. I want to take a moment to celebrate all that has been accomplished with both public and private land conservation and the policies and programs, as well as the avoided threats that have been critical to success. This has truly occurred on a landscape scale with a growing fabric of protected lands across the entire coast. In South Carolina, conservation continues to be part of the fabric of communities, in large part because of thoughtful efforts as ambassadors and advocates. This reinforces a very unique sense of place, which is celebrated across political and other demographic parameters. But the not so secret sauce, in my opinion, is really the level of cooperation in Lowcountry land conservation among the organizations. Unfortunately, you just don't see it at this level in many other regions. Your organizations all have different missions, different ways of working, different constituencies, but all are critical, just as in any ecosystem. So a little bit more about the foundation and our path here. While conservation is the largest mission area of the foundation in terms of grant funding, we realize that it's a relatively modest investment compared to your ambitions and the scale of your work. We also wish there were many more funding partners. With this in mind, we've honed our approach to focus on a few areas of particular promise and challenge. This effort started about 3 years ago through a collaborative process to develop what we call our Alternative Land Conservation Strategies Report, and this was released in 2019. With the caveat that there's always going to be some overlap and hopefully synergy, our new funding strategy breaks down into 3 general areas: climate resilience, equity and inclusion, and policy advocacy, including communication efforts. So I'd like to say a quick word about each, and then I'll turn it over to our program leads, Carrie Forrest and Rebecca Judd, who will go into more detail and share some exciting examples. So first, climate. We are all aware that this is truly an existential threat, especially in an area referred to as the Lowcountry. Our focus remains on adaptation and nature-based solutions, leaving it to others to support the critical work of emissions reductions. except as conservation relates to fostering more sensible development patterns, which some of you have been involved in. We are also expanding our geographic footprint inland to Williamsburg and Marion counties to take advantage of migration corridors along the river systems in those counties. Second, equity. There is a growing and long overdue acknowledgement that systemic racism exists throughout society, and the conservation field is no exception. To remain relevant, the field must dramatically diversify and increase its focus on expanding the benefits of conservation to all communities. Third, policy. We know that conservation doesn't exist in a vacuum. The alphabet soup of public funding programs continues to be a critical engine that drives conservation, but it goes much broader. For example, flood abatement, infrastructure investments, land use regulations. These are the policy contexts that drive conservation outcomes on a landscape scale. I'd like to close by thanking you for all that you do, for persevering through the pandemic, for embracing collaboration and the evolving opportunities that are part of these times and our collective path to a sustainable future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. My name is Rebecca Judd, and I'm the Conservation Program Officer who also helps manage our Lowcountry Land Conservation grant-making work. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And as you've just heard, David has outlined how we have gotten to today, from the alternative land strategy work started in 2018 through the expansion.
Thank you for joining
Of the Lowcountry Land Conservation Partnership, and over the past 2 years, looking at both the changing political and social landscape to develop a strategy that will help the foundation address the most critical needs in the region and leverage our funding in ways that will generate even greater benefit. Carrie and I are now going to talk a bit more about each of the 3 focus areas in depth and let you hear from some current grantees about conservation work that fits within the strategy. Carrie?
Great. Before we play the next video, I want to talk a little bit about our climate resiliency theme for the strategy. As we all know, South Carolina's climate is changing. According to a report published by the Environmental Protection Agency, most of the state has warmed by 1/2 to 1 degree in the last century, and the sea is rising at about 1 to 1.5 inches every decade. We've all seen the effects here with increased beach erosion, coastal flooding, and extreme weather events, among other impacts. The foundation's objective is to use its philanthropic dollars to support the increase in strategic protection of natural systems across the priority landscapes of the Lowcountry, using a resiliency lens and a watershed focus. The Foundation's 2019 Alternative Land Strategy report noted that there are more than 500,000 acres of working forest land in the coastal plain, much of it in priority watersheds, and 500,000 acres of salt marsh and marine and freshwater wetlands in the region as well. These provide resiliency benefits from flood control to carbon storage. And as sea levels continue to rise and development encroaches, protecting these existing floodplains and providing space for migration of natural systems and humans will be key. With that in mind, the Foundation will be providing philanthropic dollars to land trusts which demonstrate strategic protection with a resiliency focus as part of their program work, and land trusts conducting mapping and other research to identify priorities for floodplain and forest protection. With these activities, the goal is to support the protection of resilient natural landscapes over the next 5 years and secure increased support for land protection and community resiliency at the state and local levels. One example of this type of resiliency work is a multi-partner project to bring a new state park to South Carolina along the Black River. Dr. Mariah Whitehead the Southeast Land Senior Director for Open Space Institute, one of the partners leading the effort, explains some of their work.
So the Black River Project's an incredible conservation project that allows us to talk about resilience, both for human communities and for natural communities. First, the scope of this project is about a 70-mile section of the Black River. It goes in 2 coastal counties and encompasses both Georgetown and Williamsburg County on the north coast of South Carolina. This represents about half of this coastal watershed that actually extends 150 miles into 5 counties in South Carolina. But the Black River Conservation Initiative focuses in on protecting this incredible riverine resource. The Black River was the focus of conservation efforts over the past decade, but has been a quiet and somewhat uncelebrated, I think, conservation initiative that has largely been private protection. But because of the land ownership composition along this river, we really needed a new strategy to move the needle forward on protecting the riverine corridor and the lands along the river. A lot of the river is owned by a timber investment company, and by identifying a steward that was willing to come in and own riverfront properties and steward them into the future, we had a strategy to move the project forward. So state parks and some other potential partners are at the table to actually hold title to these riverfront properties. And I want to talk about what we think this increase in protection along the Black River will do, not only for resilience, but also to benefit the community otherwise. So first, the riverine protection along this 70-mile stretch was around 24,000 acres of protection. With the focused efforts of the partners working on this initiative, we anticipate about another 10,000 acres to be protected in the next few years. All of these acres will be within those 2 coastal counties. From a human resilience standpoint, what we know is that intact forested watersheds within the floodplain help to decrease flooding to downstream communities. So the communities along the river, Kingstree, Andrews, and Georgetown, and even smaller communities like the Chapee community in Dunbar could all benefit from these intact, protected, mature forested wetlands that essentially sequester water during flood events. But there's a second side to that coin, in that protecting these riverfront properties also amounts to avoided development in those areas. That means that we won't have people living in harm's way and in the path of the water. And that is actually a benefit to the communities, to emergency services, and to costs to taxpayers. We also know that these forested floodplains are essentially important for natural communities. They help to create a connected pathway that allows for habitats to migrate and shift. In these coastal counties, that might mean that we could see habitats shifting along the salinity gradient with sea level rise. We will see plant communities and animal communities shifting with temperature increases as well. And in the southeastern United States, what we know is that these river corridors actually serve as climate corridors and pathways to allow for the flexing and shifting of habitats that we anticipate in the centuries ahead as climate changes and shifts.
All right, so now we're going to turn to our second focus area, which is inclusive conservation. And the land conservation field, as Dave mentioned earlier, just like the broader environmental field, has been reckoning with the impacts of conservation on Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other people of color, and low wealth communities, and the Lowcountry is no exception. The foundation has been taking steps to foster a more equitable land conservation field over the past 5 years, providing diversity, equity, and inclusion training, not only for the foundation board and staff, but also for our grantees, participating in nonprofit working groups and philanthropic affinity spaces to research the history of conservation and discuss more equitable funding in order to prevent the perpetuation of systemic racism in the field, and supporting the creation of professional development affinity groups for BIPOC staff in the region. Rebecca?
Yes, so under the inclusive conservation objective, the foundation aims to support Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other organizations of color addressing land conservation and climate resiliency related issues through both general operating and project grants. Under this objective, we also hope to continue to support traditional white-led land conservation organizations who have a demonstrated commitment to an activation of equity policies, and not only their program work, but also their administrative operational work as well. Examples of some of these operational DEI practices include developing and using recruitment strategies and professional development initiatives to increase people of color in the land conservation field, increasing staff and board diversity, and building a more inclusive organizational culture. Program work that also can be supported include projects and initiatives centered around opportunities where traditional conservation organizations and BIPOC communities collaboratively work together to ensure that community priorities are addressed and reflected in land conservation work. We certainly hope that with this approach, the goal is to increase the number of BIPOC organizations and projects in the portfolio over the next 5 years, and also see new and increased diversity in the traditional organizations that the foundation supports. An example of a project that aligns with this objective is the work of the Center for Air Property Preservation, Southern Environmental Law Center, American Rivers, and more than 24 organizations working with the African-American communities of Andrews and Bucksport to develop climate resiliency advocates. We're about to hear from Alexis Stevens from Center for Air Property, who's going to tell us more about this important project.
The goal of the Community Climate Advocate Project is to empower communities of color to be engaged in developing solutions for overall resiliency efforts in the Lowcountry. We believe that by incorporating the community's perspective, it will make for a better resiliency plan that will serve all people. Some of the specific activities to accomplish this project goal include conducting grassroots outreach to specific communities of colors, such as those in Andrews and Bucksport that face severe impacts from sea level rise, more powerful storms, and flooding. And training a cadre of community folk to serve as community climate advocates who will participate in forums for serious engagement in planning efforts to address community issues and resilience project ideas. We'll also be conducting community dialogue and focus groups to evaluate current flooding issues and guide further evaluation by the engineer and design firms that will support the CCAs and partners in creating the community resilience implementation work plan. Speaking of community partners, in addition to us, the Center for Air Property Preservation, the partners involved also include the Audubon of South Carolina, Coastal Conservation League, the Nature Conservancy of South Carolina, Open Space Institute, Southern Environmental Law Project, and the Southern Environmental Law Center. This project addresses both the inclusion goals of the foundation and the LCP because the center, a Black-led organization, and low wealth communities of color are being resourced to address specific conservation issues in these identified communities. Also, it fosters an inclusive conservation community by increasing awareness and building engagement around land protection and other conservation related issues.
Great, thank you, Alexa. So moving on to our third focus area, advocacy and communications. The foundation has been supporting educational advocacy efforts for several years now, but we wanted to enhance this focus given the important role that advocacy plays when it comes to achieving much more comprehensive and longer term conservation outcomes beyond what traditional on-the-ground land protection activities can achieve. Types of work that could be supported under this objective include advocacy efforts related to the leveraging of existing public conservation programs and dollars, along with advocating for new conservation programs and funding to support local projects that provide robust land conservation and community benefits, including increased climate resiliency. Other work that promotes the value of wise investments in land use and nature-based infrastructure projects, and work that defends against harmful development that impacts land conservation at scale are also other examples. Other additional important efforts include using compelling communication strategies to increase public and decision maker awareness on the benefits of land conservation, which in turn can augment advocacy efforts to develop new public conservation programs and other policies, including at the state and local level. We certainly don't think that everybody has to be a policy wonk to engage in advocacy work. Instead, we believe that every conservation partner has a role to play when it comes to developing and pushing narratives around conservation and engaging with and building relationships with decision makers, government officials, local communities, and members of the public to help influence public policy on improved land conservation, sustainable land use, and enhanced climate resiliency. We are now about to hear a snippet of video remarks from Pegeen Hanrahan, who is the Southeast Conservation Director for Trust for Public Land, who is going to share a bit about her organization's work as an example of this focus area and the important role of local advocacy.
My name is Pegeen Hanrahan, and I work for the Trust for Public Land in the Southeastern United States. We are a national nonprofit organization with a motto, Land for People, but in the recent times, we've really put a greater focus on equity, health, and climate, which obviously aligns really well with Donnelly's focus areas. We have been working in the Lowcountry for many years now with Donnelly's support, and the work that we do really focuses around advocacy and around helping communities identify funding sources for protection of natural land and access to the outdoors. We have worked over the arc of time in Dorchester County, Charleston County, Berkeley County, Jasper, and also Beaufort. So we've covered a lot of the Lowcountry. And in some of those places, we've worked multiple times. Altogether, with the support of Donnelly, we've been able to assist in developing nearly $300 million worth of funding for conservation and outdoor recreation, which really relies on partnerships at the local level. And much of the work that Donnelly has supported has helped us have those relationships with on-the-ground conservation and equity and advocacy organizations in order to be able to help assess the values, goals, objectives, and leveling of playing field between communities that have historically been left behind and the local governments that represent those communities. The expertise that we bring in this particular work that we do is really around advocacy and working directly with citizen groups and elected officials in order to try to help develop conservation programs and outdoor recreation programs in counties and cities throughout the communities. Probably the biggest campaign that we worked on with Charleston County was to establish their Greenbelt program, which was a $210 million estimated program to protect land around all of Charleston County. And that has been a great and well-established program and is being used as a model for what Berkeley County is now considering. So it's sort of a strange expertise, and we need the local community-based organizations to help inform us about the values and the interests that the conservation community locally has. But coming in and assisting with design of ballot measures and communicating the values that citizens and voters have around protecting what they love about their place.
Thanks, Pegeen. Now we want to talk a little bit about the expanded area that we'll be focusing on with our funding support. As many of you know, the foundation has traditionally focused our work on the 9 coastal counties in the Lowcountry, but with the impacts of climate change in the region, focusing on resilient corridors has become the priority, making it important to not only protect coastal lands, but to start looking inland where habitats might migrate as impacts continue. So the foundation has decided that it's going to expand its funding reach into Marion and Williamsburg counties, both in the lower coastal plain, based on the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Landscapes maps, the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative map, the South Carolina Conservation Bank priorities in the lower coastal plain, the LCLCP priorities, and other conservation tools. Now we'll turn to take a look at the guidelines and eligibility for application.
Great, thank you, Carrie. So as folks can see, on this slide is an overview of our baseline eligibility requirements for those organizations and programs that have a nexus to natural and working lands conservation in that foundation's expanded Lowcountry geography that Carrie just went over, and who have an increased focus on climate resiliency, inclusion, and advocacy. Folks should go to our website to read more about these guidelines and the revised strategies 3 focus areas that we just went over. And certainly, if you would like to discuss further or are interested in applying for grant support, please reach out to us with as much advance notice as possible so that we can discuss mission fit. As a private foundation that has additional IRS requirements and restrictions that we have to comply with, there may also be some additional considerations we have to sort through, which is why talking as early in the process as possible is best. We do have 2 grant cycles each year, and our application deadlines in 2022 are April 1st and July 29th. So Carrie, going to kick it back over to you to kick off our Q&A discussion.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So if we can go to the last slide, we just want to make sure that everyone has our contact information. For all LCLCP related organizations and projects, they are to get in contact with me. For all other organizations and any advocacy or communications projects, you should get in touch with Rebecca. Again, we do want to thank everyone for their attention today. And we also want to thank Dr. Mariah Whitehead, Alexis Stevens, and Pegeen Hanrahan for their time to tell us about the projects that they have currently that are being supported by the Donnelly Foundation. And we also want to thank all of the organizations that we've been working with and that we've been in touch with as we've been developing this strategy, because it's through those discussions that we've had the ability to clarify our priorities that you see today. So we'll now turn to Q&A. And we have a few. Rebecca, I'll let you start.
Yeah, we do have a few questions in the Q&A box. First is a question about the foundation's ability to provide multi-year grants. And the answer to that question is yes. Now that the foundation has clarified our strategy, we are certainly interested in considering multi-year general operations grants. So we certainly encourage organizations and programs that, again, meet our guidelines and have an increased focus on those 3 objectives to apply, and we certainly can evaluate that application.
Great. So I believe we've got a second question that's similarly related.
Yes, we have another question regarding whether organizations need to submit different proposals for each of the three various focus areas. And the answer is no, we do not expect people to go through all of that extra work and effort. We certainly think that folks can explain on their application how their organization or program fits within either one or more of the three focus areas. I will say that when it comes to general operations support, the more objectives that an organization advances, certainly the more compelling that particular application can be. But we certainly also recognize that there may be, certain projects or more of a specific focus on one of the core objectives versus the others. Carrie, it looks like we have another question if you wanted to take that one.
Yes, so I think the last question that we have today is that for project grants, do you allow habitat restoration or maintenance expenses to be included as a portion of the overall land conservation project request? And the answer to that is we will consider each project on its own merit. We are not adverse to looking at habitat restoration as part of a project scope of work and a project budget, but it really is going to be contingent upon how it aligns with the three focus areas that we outlined today. So these are all great questions. We encourage anyone who is listening to this to please reach out to us if you have additional questions as you're working through application or considering a project for application. Again, our first application deadline is April the 1st. You can find information on our website at gddf.org. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you.